welcome to the Anthony Hay Cabinet Shop. I'm Bill Pavlak, the master cabinet maker. I'm joined by my colleagues Jeremy Tritchler over here and Mr. John Peeler over there. Today we want to talk to you about the process of making a frame and panel door, a raised panel door like this, sort of a classic thing to encounter in 18th century furniture, architectural work as well. But we want to talk about this with a particular focus on a couple of the planes that we use for this process. Right here I've got two of these planes, which we'll go into great detail about in a bit, but these are reproductions that we had made for us from originals in our collection that were made by a free black plane maker named Cesar Cheller, who was working in the middle of the 18th century up in Massachusetts, one of the first documented American plane makers. And these tools can tell us stories not just about how they were made, but also about these much bigger ideas of freedom and ingenuity in business and enslavement as well. So there's a lot of America, good and bad, just built into these things. So we want to build a door, but also pull out this story. Before we jump into too many details about Cheller, so we're kind of juggling two topics here, I just want to give you a quick sense of what goes into one of these doors. Basically, you have this wooden frame. Parts need to be tighter than this. This is pretty worn out, but the door is put together with tenons going into mortises or holes in this frame, and then you have a panel that fits in a groove all the way around that. The frame gets glued together, so it stays nice and stable over time, but the panel being wider, which is susceptible to wood moving, growing and shrinking as the humidity changes, that's allowed to float in the frame. So it's a bit of a complicated rectangle, but it's the sort of design that works beautifully. So let's dig down into this topic, making a door and thinking about Cesar Cheller. So let's start by introducing you a little more to Cesar Cheller and his world. John, tell us about Cesar.
Sure, absolutely, Bill. So Cesar is, as Bill said, living the 18th century. Like so many 18th century folks, we don't know a lot about him. We know that he first comes on record when he is owned by what we think is the first plane maker in North America by the name of Francis Nicholson. And that is Cesar probably starts his enslavement earlier than his teen years, but we know that he is working for Nicholson in the early 1730s in Wrentham, Massachusetts. Now, Wrentham is a smaller town, but it's halfway between Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston. It's right on Highway 1, can't miss it. So that's a good place to be if you're selling plane-making tools in that time. But anyway, back to Cesar. So he's a young man when he learns the trade. Like most apprentices, he is not an apprentice in the formal sense that he is serving an apprenticeship contract. It's a very different thing from being enslaved. So there is no promise of freedom for him in the future at any point as an enslaved man. He works the trade. He is probably responsible for a good bit of the output of the Nicholson shop and a lot of the tools produced there. And we know that very frequently who makes these planes by their stamp on the plane. If we could pull up the stamp for Francis Nicholson, the Nicholson stamp, on the end of the plane, they very frequently impress the maker's name, and sometimes the user as well. And this stamp gives us an idea of where the tool was made based on knowledge of where that person was working at that point in time. We also have in the collection here planes stamped with Cesar Cheller's name. It's almost certain that when he is working on the planes for the Nicholson shop, they are not being stamped with his name, they are being stamped with the Nicholson name. When he gains his freedom with the death of Francis Nicholson in 1753, he is now free to stamp his own name to the planes that he makes, and there are hundreds of those in existence. Very prolific plane maker. So Cesar, when he is freed by the death of his enslaver, Francis Nicholson, in 53, he gets a good number of things from his former master. He gets tools in his workbench, pretty much everything that he would need to carry on the trade. He even gets 10 acres of land, and very specifically 1/3 of the timber that the Nicholson shop has. So he is very much being set up to carry on this trade of plane making, which is really quite rare in North America in this time. These are the first folks doing this trade over here. Yeah.
Yeah. So Cesar's now set up as a plane maker out on his own, and it's wonderful to have this situation where you can look at a tool and say, this is the person that made it, and they started as an enslaved person, and they really did learn these skills, and they carried those skills forward with them. But Jeremy, can you talk a little bit about what's the world of a plane maker like? What is entailed in being, what does it entail to be a plane maker, and where are most folks getting their tools in 18th century America?
So a plane maker was a craftsman in their own right. They had a very detailed job that they had to do. So this is a typical plane that we use for a lot of our work. It's very simple, basic plane. It's got a flat sole or bottom. There are four main parts to this plane. There's the handle or tote that we obviously use to hold on and push this. There's the body that holds the blade in place. And then inside here, if I pull out the blade, I have my blade or cutter, and then I also have a wedge that holds that blade tightly in place. Now, some of the things that plane makers had to do in order to make this and make it usable and comfortable, inside here we've got this hole cut out of the middle of this solid piece of wood. Now, these plane bodies are usually made out of a very dense, hard wood. This particular one's made out of beech. Many of the planes that we know of were made of beech. Some planes made here in America were made of birch. It's a little more readily available. But they were dense, hard woods, so sometimes difficult to chisel and work with. When cutting out this center section here for your blade and your wedge to hold that in place, it was very, very important that this surface that the blade rests on is very flat, very clean and smooth, which takes a good amount of skill to get it that way, so that the blade, when it was inserted, would sit flat on that surface. And then it was equally important that this wedge, when it fits in here, fits very tight and snug. If that surface that the blade is on is not flat, and if this wedge does not fit well, then your blade tends to wiggle when you're using it, and you don't get a very smooth surface. We say it causes a lot of chatter on the board. So it's very important that a plane maker understands how to make all of that fit together nicely in order to make a good quality plane. Now, a lot of our planes in the 18th century, particularly here in Williamsburg, were being imported from England. England already has an excellent infrastructure in place. They have the craftsmen in place. They're able to make and produce a lot of these tools that we use here in the colonies. And so a lot of ours were being imported from England. We actually have an advertisement from the Virginia Gazette that was placed by Anthony Hay, the first master of our shop here, where he advertises that he has a number of tools, including several different types of planes, available for sale to different craftsmen in the area. So we know that these tools were being brought in. We know they were being sold here in the colonies, but primarily being made in England. There just aren't a lot of tool makers here in the colonies yet. But as we know, Peter Nicholson and Cesar Cheller were in the process of getting that changed here a little bit.
And so you have Francis Nicholson, and he also trained his son, John Nicholson. They went on and trained other folks as well, also Cesar Cheller. He had people working for him. We have an extraordinary number of planes by both Nicholson's and Cheller that survive. I think scholars can document about 725 of those. Here at Colonial Williamsburg, we are very fortunate to have almost a third of those in our collection. They were generously donated to us through a bequest by a tool collector and historian named David England about 5 years ago. So we today can hire outside plane makers like Steve Voigt and others to make us reproductions of these, so we can put them to use, because there's a lot to learn from these by actually using them. And could you use a Cesar Cheller plane? Yeah, but it's probably an unwise investment in a precious antique tool to start using it and wearing it down and so forth. So if Cesar is making lots and lots of planes for himself or for Francis Nicholson, he's spending a lot of his time chiseling out a mortise like this. And that's sort of exactly what we have to do when we start making a door, right? As I mentioned, we have this mortise here, the tenon that's going to fit into that. So there's a lot of chiseling. It's sort of noisy work. I'll come over here and I'll just start a mortise so you can get a sense of this. It is like a lot of cabinet making work, and plane making works the same way. You're striking a balance, or trying to, between precision and efficiency. So there are parts that can be really quick, and there are other parts you need to spend your time on. Well, if this mortise isn't perfectly straight, the tenon's not going to fit in there straight, the door's not going to work properly. But I'll use this tool I have here. It's a mortise chisel, very thick in cross-section. And it's really designed to do a couple of things. One is to just take a beating. So I can, go down a little bit, and then I'll move forward and start to clear out some waste. And so the other thing I have to do with this chisel, because the waste has nowhere to go but down into this hole that I'm creating, is I need to be able to pry wood chips out. So a few downward knocks, and then another one that I can come up and clear out the chips there and kind of keep going. There are as many different ways to use this chisel and create a mortise as there are people doing this work. I'll usually start by going down and then coming in, basically creating a right triangle down to depth, and then turn my tool around and fairly quickly go down the line and pry all of this out. And I am checking every now and then that I'm actually making things square. Once we've got mortises cut, for Cheller, it's going to be about fitting that blade and fitting that wedge. For us in making the door today, it's going to be about sawing and fitting a tenon. So we won't do that right now, but we've got some footage of John cutting a tenon. So let's look at cutting a tenon, starting with a big back saw. Take it from there.
Yeah, so I start the saw pretty slowly, but you'll notice I get pretty quick to using that full length of the blade, the plate of the saw pretty quickly. It is a time-consuming process, but you'd be surprised with a little bit of practice how quickly you can chew through a relatively small amount of wood. I'm working down here, getting close to my lines. I really don't want to go over those lines, because if I do, it's going to show in the finished project, and I try to keep my mistakes to myself. Now I'm sawing what's called the shoulder of the tenon, which is the little step away from that, and cutting away the refuse there, 2 saw cuts that join together to create the space in between. And after that's done, I need to come back and get a really crisp edge to that shoulder, because that shoulder is what's going to meet the other parts of the frame of the door and give us a good, nice, clean look to things. So if you don't have a clean shoulder cut here with the chisel and mallet, then you won't have a nicely fitting door there, and we pop out the little bit of waste with the tool. And so there we are. There's cutting a tenon.
Well, thanks, John. And so just as the tenon lives in a mortise, and with the rest of the door, we have our panel that's fielded or beveled off here, and that lives in a groove. And so the 2 planes that we have that are modeled after Cheller originals are one for cutting that groove, called the plow plane, and another for creating this raised or fielded panel, called the panel raising plane. So forgive me for 1 second, I'm going to make a loud sound. All right, and now I'm going to turn things over to John again, who's going to talk through this plow plane and some of the innovations that Cheller and the Nicholsons were part of.
Yeah, so the plow plane has a couple of moving parts for sure. The innovation of this tool specifically for the Nicholson shop, it is thought that Nicholson is responsible for the proliferation in the North Americas of this tool. The Yankee plow is great for a couple of reasons here, in contrast to other more frequently known tools in the English tradition. This is called a wedge arm plow because we use little wedges to secure the fence here. Oop, going the wrong way. Oh well. The wedges here will secure the fence, but that percussive action there can be very difficult to set the fence, and the fence is the part of the tool that guides the plane in its use. So we want that to be able to be pretty precisely set. So instead of mucking about with the wedges on the wedge arm plow, the Nicholson shop appears to have come up with and used a lot, instead of wedges, screws here in the back and front of the plane, which allow us to very precisely set that fence, tighten it down, and then check it, of course, with the rule. Check it, of course, with the rule, and then go for it with the tool itself. Just like Jeremy was talking about with most planes, we've got the fence here, we've got the cutter, sometimes called the iron down here, and then this metal part here is the skate of the plane, and that will actually ride within the groove. That's why it's so skinny there. So I'm going to grab, we're lucky enough to actually have 2 of these planes in the shop. So we have one set up to cut just the dimension that we need, because we really don't want to mess with that setup before you are ready and done with your tool. So here we go. Got a piece of black walnut in the bench vise here, and I'm going to set it just a little bit better. There we are. And I'm going to rest the fence of that plane, rest the fence of the plane on the piece of wood, on that reference side. And I'm going to start here at the end, and being careful to hold the tool very plumb, so straight up and down. I'm just going to cut just a little bit there. And I'm going to start working my way back, pushing forward, even pressure. And we're establishing the groove here as it cuts down. Now, the great thing about this tool is that, again, as long as you keep it very straight up and down, it does a lot of the work for you. You're, of course, still having to push it with your body, but otherwise, it is creating a groove really well for you and can actually go pretty fast. So we've got one more groove to cut in our panel here, in a frame for our panel, and that's this piece right here. So let's see how long this actually takes. So here we go. Whoop. I better cut it on the right side, shouldn't I? Is that a good idea, guys? Yeah.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, you heard it here, folks. Cut it on the right side. So I've got the right. Yeah, here we go. Let's see, we're almost there. A little bit more. A little bit disagreeable piece of wood, but that's all right. Now you might ask, how do you know when you're down to depth with this tool? And it has a handy little tool in it called a depth stop. And I'm going to go back to the other plane so you can see it. But the depth stop with this little screw here is adjustable. And it's this piece of wood right here that can go up and down. And when it is to the right position, it will stop the plane from cutting at just the right depth. It's a bit complicated, but that is another great innovation on the Yankee plow plane from the Cheller and Nicholson shop that allows us to very precisely cut exactly the groove that we want to. So right, there we are. So that's cutting the groove in that frame for the frame and panel door, and then I think we need to move on to the panel itself.
Okay, so when we're cutting the panel, there are a few different options in this time period to do this. We talked about we're using specifically this panel raising plane, but let me show you a couple of other planes that could do the same task before I really dive into this one. One plane that could be used is referred to as a rabbet plane. And you can see on this plane, it's a little different than some of the other planes we've shown you, especially that basic plane I had. On the simple basic plane, you see the cutter is completely housed inside the body. In this case, the cutter actually comes out to the outside edge on either side. That allows me to get right up close to this little step down from the center of this panel to where these bevels are that I'm going to create my panel. So I can take that plane, I can use that to create this. I can also use a version of this plane, where in this case, this blade on the first one, you can see it goes straight across the plane. On this second version, it's skewed. Now this skewed angle allows me to actually cut very nicely across end grain. Typically with a straighter cutter, if I go across end grain, it's going to tear a lot of fibers. It's going to make a real mess. So with this skewed blade, this allows me to cut across that, create a smoother finished surface, so I don't have to spend as much time cleaning that up when I'm done. I'm really ready to just stick this in my door, glue everything up, and move on in the process. But again, with this one, it requires a bit of skill from the maker to be able to line up and keep that in line with where they want to go. There's no fences on this to guide me, like the plane that John was using. So there is another plane that's very similar to that one. This one does incorporate a fence on the bottom, which tells me just how far in that plane is going to go into my board. I also have a depth stop, just like on John's. This one's a little fancier. It's made out of brass here. But that depth stop allows me to go a certain depth. I've got a fence on the bottom to go in a certain amount to create the distance that I want this beveled side to be. Now with the planes that we're going to be using, with this Cesar Cheller plane, it doesn't have a set depth stop, but it does have a fixed fence on the side. So I can't adjust how big of a space I'm going to be cutting, but that's okay. This is going to guide me just fine, and it seems to create a pretty nice size anyway for a lot of the panels that we make here in the shop. It also does incorporate that angled cutter so that I can get a nice smooth cut across end grain. It also works just as well on the long grain of the board too. So let me show you how this plane works to get this all working out for me. Now, one thing this doesn't do for me, it does not determine the angle that I want to have this bevel at. I do have to do that a little bit by feel and just kind of looking to see what I want for an angle so that the thinnest part of this panel can fit inside the groove that John just made. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this up against here, butt that fence, that stop, right up against the side of the board, angle this just a little bit, about where I think I've done the rest of the sides of this board here, and I'm going to start to plane. Now, as I'm planing across, it's like any other plane. Not necessarily the most exciting process to watch, but that's slowly beginning to work down. See all those nice shavings come flying out here, kind of get in the way. That's starting to work down a little bit of an angle. And I'll work down for a while, and eventually I can begin to watch and see there will be an angle that starts to form that connects this outside corner with the outside corner of this center of the panel. And I can watch that angle form at both of these corners and try to keep that at about 45 degrees. And that's going to help me gauge to make sure that this bevel is the same as this bevel and this bevel. And I'm going to work on that for just a couple of minutes here, get this closer to finished. I think I'm going to let Bill talk to you a little bit about some other types of planes that we use.
Yeah, so there are many different ways to make a panel plane. There are many different varieties of plow planes. The simplicity of this panel plane, the fact that it doesn't have a moving fence, also, while it has some limitations, it creates great flexibility. You can work in stock of any size with it. Most of the planes that Cheller and Nicholson would have made, most of the planes that we own today, most of them that most cabinet makers would have owned would have been molding planes with very specific profiles of different types to create all of the different molded features that you'll see. Sometimes these raised panels, instead of being a flat field or bevel, it'll actually be curved a little bit. You probably can see on this door, just as the bevel comes down into the rail, we also have a molding on the edge of the rail and the stile coming down into the panel. That complicates the joinery immensely, so we decided to leave it out for our quick door today. But when Jeremy gets this done, I'll show you very quickly how to run out a molding with one of these planes. Now, we mentioned that Cheller and Nicholson are at a part of some innovations in plane designs. Like with most things, we can't say with any sort of certainty that he was the first to do this or that. But certainly the surviving evidence, both documentary and physical, suggests that if they weren't the first, they were right there on the vanguard of these developments. And planes continue to be normal, everyday woodworking tools on through the 19th century and into the 20th. But there are, and as you can imagine, there's a century of changes, and the change just keeps accelerating. So the more of Jeremy's blade, and we can look at how he's progressing, the more of his blade that's biting into the wood, the more friction, the more resistance he's encountering here. But he's getting pretty close.
So if you can see this corner over here, at this corner I'm starting to get this raised corner that comes right up along there like that. I'm starting to watch that closely, beginning to see that move closer and closer to where I want it to be. My other end here, it hasn't moved quite as much, so I've been taking more wood off that side there. Need to kind of compensate. And there's a few ways we can do that. Take more shavings at one end to get that down a little faster. You can also see that I've started to establish this little step down or fillet along that side more than this end. So just working it back. Get it a little closer there.
So as Jeremy's finishing that up, if we can come over to this camera over here, and I can show this molding plane in action. So this is a very simple molding plane. It's called a bead plane. So the shape of the sole, or the bottom of the plane, It's the same as the shape of the cutter inside of it, and this is going to create the opposite of the shape, in this case, a bead. So if I push this over the edge of this board, very quickly, I should be able to create a nice bead with a full round profile. And again, most of the planes you had in the 18th century are going to be molding planes, the kind of thing you don't use every 5 minutes, but every time you need a different shape, you need a different plane. Every time you need a different size, you need a different plane. One of the nice things about the plow plane that John showed you is you can actually put different size cutters in there. So this plane has a built-in depth stop, and in a second, it's just going to stop cutting. Let's see here. One more pass, I think. Yeah, and then, right, it wasn't cutting down there at all. That's it. And this sort of can create a nice, full bead. But again, we have a few dozen of these molding planes. We're looking forward to having more, of course. When Edmund Dickinson, the last man that ran the Anthony Hay shop in the 18th century, passed away in 1778, they inventoried his possessions. It listed 81 planes of various sorts. Most of those planes would have been one molding profile or another. So normally, again, we would work that into a door, but we decided to make this one a little bit simpler for the purpose of the live stream. How you doing, Jeremy?
Almost there, actually.
Almost there. And there's a lot of this, when we always make one part fit another part. So we don't make a bunch of these parts and expect them all to fit together. John made the groove, and now Jeremy is making that panel fit into that specific groove. Each mortise has a tenon made custom for it, so we tend to label all of our parts. And we'll see that on 18th century planes. We'll also see it on 18th century furniture. Little witness or marriage marks. This is wedge 3, and this is plane number 3 of the batch that they might have been cooking up at that particular time. You'll notice that the bevel that he's creating is just a straight up bevel. A little bit later on, well, also at this time in France, you'll start to see some that have a bevel and then come into a little flat, a tongue, so that you have a consistent thickness going into your groove. But most 18th century American things that I've looked at just have a bevel that comes almost down to a feathered edge. The main goal of this is to look pretty and to allow this panel to expand and contract. Originally, historically, things were very crudely beveled off just so they would fit in the groove, and actually the bevel was put on the inside of a piece, so you didn't actually see it. And then eventually they decided to make more of an issue of it and really dress things up. So we're going to make some noise here. We're going to now try to put our door together. The panel should fit relatively easily into the frame, but the mortise and tenons should be basically hammer tight. So we'll see how the fellas did here.
The pressure.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, fortunately, I can say I'm sweating because I was planing so much.
Right. I'm just, give it a wiggle, Jeremy. Come on.
What?
Is it too long?
There we go.
There we are.
Okay.
That's good fit. All right, here we go.
There's no pre-made cook and show parts here. This is live, so no pressure whatsoever.
There we go.
Got
Got this side. Yeah. 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 Ooh.
Yeah, sometimes the panel will be a little bit long, and you wouldn't find that out until this part of the process. But here we go.
All right, there we go.
Look at that. Beautiful black walnut with some curl in it. One could say it's adorable.
Yeah. Thank you, Bill. Yeah.
You're welcome.
You might,
I apologize to everyone else, though.
a couple of things that will, of course, be made better if this were used in an actual piece is that these extra haunches down here, the horns, however you want to perceive it, those will be cut off when the panel is done. And I don't know how well you can see it at home, but a little bit of the tenon is sticking out of the mortise here. And that's just to help it guide through the mortise itself and seat a little bit easier. And we'll, of course, cut those off and trim it to a nice rectangular fitting door in whatever we are making. But there we go. That actually worked. Look at that, Bill.
Yeah, and so it's great. I had faith in you the whole time.
Thank
I believe
you.
in you. These longer sections here are a great safety. That joint is so tight that if you had cut it off already, this would blow apart. And if this one didn't, the other three would. So As we look at old furniture and old tools, again, tool marks guide us through this process. They tell us how this was done, we learn how to coax stories out of this old thing. So we left Cesar Cheller off making a lot of plans and innovating, and being a very successful businessman. What happens with Cesar? Let's finish off his story.
So again, we don't know a ton about his later years. We know that he is successful and prolific for at least 30 years. He dies in 1783 in Wrentham, is married with, I believe, 8 kids, and is from the hundreds of tools that survive directly with his name on them, and the hundreds more that were probably touched by his hands and made by his hands over the years. We can say that he was a very successful person, both enslaved and as a free person, a very prolific maker. So he dies in actually I believe it was 84, if I'm thinking so right now. Dies in 84 because 1783 is also an important year in Massachusetts. 1783 is the year that the Supreme Court, State Supreme Court of Massachusetts effectively outlaws slavery. So I would like to think that as a successful man in the community, Cesar Cheller perhaps is there to contribute to the abolitionist sentiment that is there in Massachusetts. It will, of course, be many years before that is codified at the national level, but for Massachusetts, within their borders, enslavement is ended by the time the year before Cesar dies. So that we do know.
One of the wonderful things about working here and having access to this incredible collection of planes and other objects is that we are right now able to begin a project for the next few years where we'll be having other planes by Cheller and Nicholson reproduced for our use here in the shop, so we can continue to tell these stories. But right now, we would love to hear from you. So what kind of questions you might have. So.
Well, first off, thank you so much, Jeremy, John, and Bill, for joining us this afternoon and sharing this brilliant presentation. This is a fantastic look into this part of your work. We're really thankful to have you guys. Now, before we dive into the nitty-gritty of planes, we actually do have a second grade class from McCutcheonville Elementary School who want to know just a little bit about what your shop would typically produce and maybe what type of materials you would use.
Okay, that's a great question, and it also brings us into Cesar Cheller, too. Most of the planes that Cesar Cheller and Francis Nicholson made were for people called joiners, the guys that were building houses, making windows and doors and all the moldings that you see between a wall and a ceiling. They also made some for cabinet makers. We say cabinet maker. Today, you guys in second grade might think of, when you think of cabinet, you might think of your kitchen. But in the 18th century, when we say a cabinet maker, we really mean somebody that makes furniture. And not just any old piece of furniture. It's usually the higher style, the fancier stuff, the kind of stuff made with beautiful woods like black walnut here. This is a local Virginia wood, but it wasn't cheap. It was still fairly pricey. It's the sort of thing that we can show off a little bit. We don't need to paint this or anything. We want to show off that chocolatey brown color. We'd also use quite a bit of mahogany. So here's another door panel with a nice arch top to it, more red-brown colored wood there in mahogany. So we're using a lot of walnut, a lot of mahogany, but we'll make things like chairs and tables and desks and where are you going to put your clothes? You're probably going to store them in a chest of drawers. So fine furniture is what you'd expect from a cabinet shop like this.
And actually, building off of that, Doug was wondering how difficult it is today to source materials that would have been appropriate in the 18th century, the types of woods they would have been prioritizing in the 18th century.
Yeah, sure. So, finding the appropriate materials today is tough and sometimes expensive. We are very fortunate here at Colonial Williamsburg, both at the foundation level as a whole, to have resources that we need to do our job and present that to you. But also here in that cabinet shop, we have great stacks of lumber. Walnut, black walnut, like Bill was saying, and mahogany. There are some types of mahogany that are not only expensive, but almost impossible to get today because mahogany was used so much in the 18th century and 19th century and beyond. Certain species of mahogany are restricted as imports. So you have to have a very expensive license to import them and that sort of thing. And we are, again, very lucky to have a little bit of that around. but most of the mahogany is the same stuff that we use today, is the same stuff that you can find at a nice hardwood dealer today. Am I answering that question okay? Is that
And I think we could also say that we are sort of blessed and cursed by the fact that we don't make thousands of pieces of furniture like a factory. So the sorts of issues that we have in finding wood and sourcing it aren't as great as somebody running a modern, manufacturing company. So we can rely, I always like to say, we can rely on fairly unreliable sources of wood. This walnut that we were working probably came from right here at Colonial Williamsburg 10 years ago during Hurricane Irene. And we were able to have that stuff milled up. We are very frugal, maybe let's just say stingy or miserly with how we use mahogany, because we know that is getting harder and harder to come by. Folks in the 18th century were well aware of all of this as well. Wood may be more abundant, but it's not easy to chop a tree that's this big around down in Jamaica with axes, get it on a boat, get it to Norfolk, Virginia, and then get it up here to us, and so forth. So there's a lot of cost in wood. They're very, very frugal about it. And so we learn from their frugality.
So moving back to planes, David, who's joining us from the UK, has never seen a Yankee plow plane before and was actually wondering if you might be able to give us a little bit more information on that specific plane, when it became popular, and how popularly it was accepted, say, throughout the English-speaking world.
Yeah, so it's called the Yankee plow, by the way. Down here in the South, we tend to call folks up north Yankees, but in the 18th century, the Yankee is the American. And this is the type of tool that was adopted here in America. Now, there are plenty of plows of other stripes, like the wedge arm plow that I talked about, but you notice some immediate differences there. The one at the bottom, the Yankee plow, that is quite a bit longer than the wedge arm up here. And that length, as Bill mentioned just a little bit, contributes to the fact that a lot of the planes that Cheller and Nicholson were making in Wrentham back in the 18th century are planes for house joiners. So this is going to be a plane to cut a groove that's 12 foot long if you needed to. And the longer the plane, the more suited to that type of work it is. So the Yankee plow shows up in the 18th century. The originals that we have in the collection are 18th century make by Nicholson and Cheller. And these tools with the depth stop and the screw arms the screws that contact the arms to keep the fence from moving in use, those are innovations we think of the Nicholson and Cheller shop. They were, at least through extant pieces, through extant tools that are still around, it appears that they were at least on the very leading edge of making and using these tools.
Yeah, and I don't know if either of you are familiar with where the term Yankee plow originates, but I doubt it's an 18th century thing. It's probably more of a tool collector later on that's labeling them as such. But you see this basic design with those screws like that. Companies are manufacturing those in the later 19th century, so it does persist, but it is a good example of however English we are in our cabinet making here in America, we do still have some of these differences. So there are planes similar to the panel raiser called Badger planes that just about never show up in American shops in the 19th century, but they're very popular in England. So sometimes we're really close, and other times it's a really big ocean between us. So.
And maybe staying on the nitty-gritty and, dare I say, bordering esoteric, Mark was wondering if you guys had maybe favorite planes that you like to use individually.
Depends on the project I'm working on, really. It's I don't know. This was actually, surprisingly, a lot of fun to use. It's a little bit of effort, but currently, this is my favorite plane. It's just, it's the one I've been getting used to recently. It worked really well, it handled well, and it does a really nice job. Bill and I were talking about this the other day. You essentially create a finished product that has a nice look to it in a relatively short amount of time with this plane. So, I don't know, though, if I could say that, I have a favorite. You guys have a favorite?
Well, the quick sarcastic answer, but it's always the true answer, is a Sharp plane is always our favorite. Mine is sort of varied, but my favorite plane probably is a version of this plane. It's a little bit wider. It was made by a man named Don McConnell, who's a great plane maker and historian of these tools, It is not for creating fancy panels or anything like that. It is a plane that we use, called a four-plane or a jack plane, to just quickly hog off material. I poured more sweat into that plane and more tears probably into it as well. That's been in my hands most, and it's wonderfully comfortable and well balanced. And I love the fact that, well, it's wonderful to have antiques, but I love the fact that it's made by somebody that I could talk to. And also, it was something that I inherited. It was used for about 20 years in the shop before I ever used it. So I like having that recent history. We love the 18th century, but I like the modern history tied up with that one in particular. John, do you have a favorite?
Yeah, I do actually. I've had the luck to think about what my favorite is just here in the moment. My favorite tool is called a toothing plane. And if you're a woodworker, you should look up toothing planes, like tooth like your teeth. And they're called that because, all of these planes that we have out here today, they have one thing in common. They have a straight cutting blade. It's like a knife blade, a very sharp knife, right, or a razor, except for the toothing plane. And the truth is that with really, really difficult or figured woods where the grain twists around, those can be a challenge to plane with a regular old smoothing plane or panel razor or what have you. The wood can be uncooperative. However, with the toothing plane, because of how the blade works, it's more like a serrated knife instead of a clean, straight knife edge. And that serration gets in there, and it essentially scratches the wood into submission. And essentially, you don't need to worry about those really crazy, figured, beautiful grains of wood, whether it's a hardwood or a softwood, does not matter. The toothing plane can help you remove material without worrying about that. And later on, that does leave a surface that is all scratched up, but you can come back with other tools like scrapers and that sort of thing to smooth that surface. So on numerous occasions, the toothing plane has been a magic tool in my hands, and more so for its utility than my efforts. So that is definitely my favorite.
So we've talked a bit about the importation of planes and the origins of plane manufacturing here in what becomes the United States. Both Duncan and Patrick were wondering, would it have been terribly uncommon for cabinet shops or other woodworking trades to have made their own planes?
Yeah, not at all uncommon. There are many, many examples of planes that are probably user-made planes. There are a lot of plane makers in the 18th century that are probably part-time plane makers, like a lot of plane makers today. And so they're walking this line between being professionals and just doing it on their own. The nice thing about these planes is that they are made out of wood. We get wood. We understand it. The other thing is we use the tools. And in using these tools, you have to know how to maintain them. I have some planes that I've maintained so much that I feel like I could put my name next to the makers, rightfully. So you do, in your apprenticeship, really gain an understanding of how these work. You might not have some of the specialized tools to do it, but yes, absolutely, you're going to see user-made planes. The question always is going to be one of economy. It sounds on the surface often cheaper to make my own, but think about your time. Is it easier for me, especially in a town like Williamsburg, right, where we are plugged in to trade, and it's a global network, right? I can get a plane from England fairly easily here in town. But if I'm out in the country, it's going to more likely that I'm going to make my own. Here in Williamsburg, I might say, I could spend a day's wage on a plane, or I could spend my day making money and then just buy that plane. So we'll see, but we do see some beautiful shop-made examples. We see some awful ones that were clearly made by somebody who wasn't a plane maker. So it's you get the whole range there.
And Steve was wondering what type of wood was used to make the planes, and actually building off of what you're just talking about as well, Bill, could you also speak to the maintenance of these instruments?
Yeah, so Jeremy, you wanted to handle the wood?
Sure.
Talked about that a little earlier.
Yeah, so primarily, most of our planes that we see are made of beech, but they don't have to be out of beech. We also do know, particularly up in New England, we do know birch was commonly used. I believe a lot of the Cheller planes are birch, in fact. All of them are birch, yeah. So birch is an excellent wood. I've heard of some modern makers using cherry for planes. I haven't used a cherry plane. I couldn't speak to how well that holds up. But it really, you just want a good, tight-grained, hard, dense hardwood that's going to hold up well to use and abuse. I have a plane at home. It was just kind of a fun little thing that's made out of walnut. It does not hold up well to use and abuse, I'll just say. So But most of the ones that we find, especially today, that are wooden, people are tending to make them out of beech.
And that's the classic English plane making wood. Beech has these advantages of being very durable, but cheap and abundant. So these are utilitarian things. You will see beautiful mahogany planes that probably don't work very well. The French have a different tradition, are using different woods to make their planes. In terms of maintenance, I think a plane is so simple that, let's look at that one, yeah, okay. Planes are so simple. It's one of those things that are so simple that it's so easy for things to not work at all. As Jeremy was saying, the seasons change, the wood moves, and so now maybe the blade and the wedge don't quite fit well, or you use a molding plane only every once in a while, and you go to use it, and you push, and the blade shoots back at you because the wedge has shrunk. It's really dry in the air. So you can use a plane to plane the wedge and fit it back up. The planes like this that we use to make boards flat needs to be flat on its bottom. They are not going to stay flat. And usually when we know our blades are sharp and we're having trouble getting a board flat, it's usually time to take a straight edge and check the bottom of our plane. And again, it's made out of wood, so I can use a bigger plane to plane this plane flat and check it. So dealing with wood really, I think, is the main thing with this, the fact that wood will move. Sometimes the handles break or it just doesn't fit your hand, and you can refashion that or so. Mostly with the blades, it's a matter of sharpening it, which is, if you ever want a headache, Google sharpening woodworking tools, and you'll find things that make any other debate in America look, very, very tame by comparison. But one of the first things you will learn how to do. I don't consider that you know how to use this tool until you know how to sharpen it. And then also learning how to maintain it, because it is, as we start to come into the humid time of year, this is going to work differently than it did a couple of months ago. And sometimes it'll still work okay, but oftentimes it just won't work at all. And I can only flatten it so many times before the mouth at the bottom opens up too much, and then I have to plug that. So you definitely learn how to work on those.
So we do have time for one last question, and actually for this question, I'm hoping you might be able to offer our audience some more resources on how they can explore for themselves the lives and works of Cesar Cheller and Nicholson.
Yeah, I think a great place to start would be Colonial Williamsburg's E-Museum. If you look up Google Colonial Williamsburg E-Museum, we'll have a link actually in the comments. Our curators have put a lot of stuff in the E-Museum, and it's constantly being updated. So some of the entries are just a photograph. Some of them have many angles of a piece of furniture or a plane. So again, we have about 248, I think it is, or maybe a little more than that, Cheller and Nicholson planes. Most of those have been cataloged. Many of them are on E-Museum with multiple views. You can follow it with that to really see the specifics of those tools. So check out E-Museum. The other thing is, probably next year, in 22, there will be dedicated space in the galleries of the art museums at Colonial Williamsburg to show off some of these planes. The stories they tell are too important to keep those in hiding, so they will be out on display. Not that you can go and use them and handle them, but the E-Museum is a really wonderful resource for our collection.
Also, there are a good number of scholarly articles. So if you're really deep into this and want to know more, everything that we know, there have been a couple of articles in the last 20 or so years, something like that. One is in the Chronicle, which is a magazine put out by the Early American Industries Association, or EAIA. And this one is in the volume 70, number 2, June 2017, so pretty recent in the Chronicle there, talking a lot about the specifics of Nicholson and Cheller and their works and what comes from that. From a little bit more recent, however...
So recently, actually, the individual that made these two reproductions for us, both the Yankee plow and this panel raiser, he had an article that he wrote for Mortise and Tenon magazine, and this article came out last year, and it's a great article. So Steve Voigt wrote this article about a little bit about Cesar Cheller. He also talks a little about these two specific planes and what he learned, what he found in them while he was making them. Excellent article to look at as well.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, John, and Bill, for sharing your expertise and experience with us today. As we do finish up, we would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you from viewing from home and for joining us today. And we would also like to take this opportunity to thank our donors. Programs like this are made possible by the generous support of viewers like you, and to learn more about how you can contribute to our programming, please follow the link in the comments section or visit our website at www.colonialwilliamsburg.org. Jeremy, John, and Bill, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with today?
Yeah, I think on that note, I should mention again that our ability to study these planes this carefully comes from such generosity. David England, who had the largest personal collection of these planes, willed them to Colonial Williamsburg at his death, and we now have them to study, and very generously gave them to us so that we can share them with the world. One of the things I'm looking forward to in the next couple of years, we've also gotten some gift money that we are going to put towards having more reproductions of Cheller and Nicholson planes made for our use in the shop. So we have these tangible items that we can show to people, not only improve our work, but also help tell this very rich little corner of America's story. But we thank you all for joining us today. Thanks, Jeremy and John. We'll see you all around. We're in the museum these days, one day a week, usually on Mondays. But otherwise, we'll see you all around. Stay safe.